All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. Hackettstown Library is pleased to present The Art and Craft of Writing Fiction with Eric J. Matluck. So, Eric, take it away.
Oh, yes.
You may
Hello.
begin.
I am here to talk about writing, why I write, how I started writing, why I started writing, and what it takes to put together a novel. I've written four of those. Two are available on Amazon, and 11 short stories, none of which I've had published. So we go back a long time to the time when I was 5 years old, which would be the early to mid 60s. And that's when I started writing. And I wanted to write because I loved books. Now, understand when I say I loved books, I don't mean I loved reading. I didn't like reading. I didn't read. I loved books, which is to say, picking up a book, looking at it, thumbing through the pages. There was something about it just incredibly evocative. And I loved going into bookstores and picking up books and buying them. And then, of course, just never reading them. I read my first novel when I was in my 20s. I ended up passing high school senior English with a D triple minus because my teacher couldn't bring himself to fail me. And yes, I've been an editor for the past 41 years, so go figure how that works. Writing was something I always wanted to do because I wanted to produce a book. Reading just never appealed to me. Uh, so when I started writing when I was 5, between the ages of 5 and 9, I started maybe a dozen novels, quote unquote. And what I did was I would take a piece of typewriter paper, for those of us who are old enough to remember what typewriters are, and put lined paper behind it so I could keep my lines of text straight. And I would just have an idea for something I wanted to write about, and I would come up with a title that appealed to me. And I would just start writing spontaneously. And the most I ever wrote was maybe 25 pages. And then I would just lose interest in it. And then maybe a year later, I would come back and start something else and lose interest in that. And that's how I began writing. And the whole idea was that I was going to write something that would look like a book. I mean, I didn't think about what a cover would be or anything. It was just, I had the pages, and that's what was exciting. And that's how it all started. I would say, yeah, I probably started about a dozen novels between the ages of 6 and 9. Then there was a big jump in time, and then I was 16, and I tried to start on a novel again. But this time, I started more slowly. It wasn't going to be spontaneous. I had uh, a title, I had an idea in my head. I had specific characters I wanted to bring to life. So what I did was cut out pictures from newspapers and magazines of people who I thought looked like the characters I was envisioning. And then I would start writing what was running through their minds. And in that way, the novel kind of started to come together. But again, I was only 16 and I hadn't actually read any fiction yet. So I didn't really know how to put a story together. So that kind of trailed off after maybe a year and a half. So I had like maybe 35 or 40 pages written until I realized, I'm not in my element here. I'm just going to walk away and not feel bad about it. Then, when I was 19, I had an idea for a novella, and I wrote out an incredibly detailed outline. It must have been maybe 20 pages long. And I wrote maybe 200 or 300 pages worth of notes. This was in the days before computers, so I wasn't going to sit at a typewriter and start typing all this out. It was just faster if I wrote. And then I realized, I'm not ready to actually put something serious together yet. So there was this, again, big gap of years. And finally, when I was 32, I wrote my first short story. And there was kind of an interesting, to me, it was interesting, story behind that. I had a friend who belonged to a writers club, and there were about 6 of us, and we met every other week at a bookstore in Denville. And people would write things from one meeting to the next, and then we would all listen to them and critique them. I had very mixed feelings on critiquing other people's writing, because I always thought writing was a form of self-expression that pretty much doesn't really take into account what other people think or how other people feel about it. It's just you expressing yourself, and there's no right and there's no wrong. It's not mathematics, as I'm always fond of saying. So I would sit and listen and give my opinions, and I always tried to make them as positive as I could. And I thought that what the people were writing was really good, but finally, after about 5 or 6 meetings, this one woman said to me, "You always criticize other people's work, but you never write anything of your own. Why don't you?" And I didn't have an answer. So I thought, all right, I'll write a short story, which I did. And it was about 10 pages, and it took me maybe 3 or 4 months to write. And I really liked it, and they really liked it. And I thought to myself, maybe I'm onto something here. So that between 1994 and 2021, I wrote 11 short stories. And sometimes they came very quickly and spontaneously, and sometimes they required more effort than a novel required, because a short story, you don't have as much room to hide as a writer as you do in a novel. Everything is kind of there and upfront, and has to be polished just right. And it's in many ways harder. So it's more concentrated, and you have to be able to focus what you're trying to put across. But I always enjoyed doing that, but I still wanted to write that novel so I could have something that looks like a book, and satisfy myself with that long old desire. So my first novel came out in 2010. It was big. It was 660,000 words, a little over 660,000 words, which made it about 80,000 words longer than War and Peace, and the length of about 8 long novels. And it was something I knew wasn't going to get published. And I thought, let me just, I have a friend who was working for a printing company at the time, and I wrote it all out on my computer, and it took maybe 2 years to put together. And I brought it into her one day and I said, let's print it out and see what it looks like. And it looked like that. And it was like, oh yeah, this isn't going anywhere. I gave it out to like 15 or 20 people. I'm sure I'm the only person who read it from cover to cover. I hope. I mean, I can't imagine that anybody else did. Somebody was nice enough to let me know that they were using it as a decorative doorstop. It did have an attractive cover on it, so there was that. Yeah, well, I got that out of my system, so that felt good. You know, and what I did was I put it on paper that had, you know, 3 holes punched in it, and then I put it in a loose leaf binder, and I put on a cover, and I put on a back cover, I put on a spine, and it was like, ah, okay, I finally have a book. So that was pretty exciting. And then my second novel, which was less than 80,000 words, so a lot shorter than my first one, was written in 2016. And that was based on a trial on which I had been a juror 22 years earlier. And to make it as authentic as I could, I called up it was in Warren County. So I called the courthouse in Belvedere and I asked if I could get a transcript of this trial that had occurred 22 years earlier. And they said, yes, but it's going to be expensive. And I said, how expensive is a transcript? And she said, it's going to be between $12,000 and $15,000. And I kid you not. And it turns out it's usually because it's lawyers who are asking for these things, and lawyers have the money for it. And so I basically decimated my bank account, and I bought the transcript because I was so determined to write this novel. Oh, there was $12,000 or $15,000 that I was never going to see again. But I still have both the novel and the transcript in case anybody wants to buy it. I could sell it to you for a lot less. And it was fascinating because reading through the transcript, it was like, oh my God, it was like this. And you have to boil that down into a novel. And there's so much, it's like every little, yeah, you know, it's like, it's all there. And reading through it, it's like, it must have taken 6 months to pull out what was substantial and contributed to the case. And then I finally finished it, and I suddenly had this realization: what happens if I have this published and the man who was on trial ends up reading it? I don't think that's going to be a good thing. So I decided, well, let me do what I did the last time, and I'll print it out on 3-hole punch paper and put it in a loose leaf book and hand it out to people, and nobody's going to read it, and nobody read it. And that was fine. I mean, you know, I haven't gotten any death threats, so I take that as a positive. And then a couple of more years passed by, and then I thought, all right, let me actually do something that might attract an audience. So I wrote a book called Notes for a Eulogy that was based on a story that I heard about somebody who had married, I won't get into any detail because we don't know who's going to be listening to this, somebody who had married somebody else whose basically entire existence pretty much turned out to be a lie. And so what I did in my book was write a story about 2 people who work together, and one tells the other all about his life, except that virtually everything he says is a lie. So what happens is we have paragraph after paragraph of him explaining things, and then we break and we have paragraph after paragraph of what really happened, and you get to see this kind of dichotomy between his real life and the life he's putting forward to other people. And I tried getting that published. So what I did was I went to a site called Readsy, and I found a list of maybe 700 literary agents. And from that, I boiled it down to about 200, who most of whom, if not all of whom, were based in the United States. And we're dealing with the kind of fiction I was trying to put across. And so I submitted online, the first chapter or the first 3 chapters or the first 25 pages or whatever they wanted, and just sat back and counted the number of rejections. It's like, thank you so much, but I don't think this quite fits our need. And after, I guess, the third time that happened, I thought, this is just not going to go anywhere. And then somebody I used to work with said, why don't you try getting it published yourself? And that was a whole new concept to me. I didn't even realize that somebody could do that. So I looked into self-publishing, and I found out that you can get it professionally designed, you can get it professionally printed, you can hire a publicist who will, be your mouthpiece and talk up the book. And it seemed very compelling, and so that's what I did, and that worked out really nicely, and it's available for sale on Amazon. I mean, it didn't get a tremendous amount of response, but that's okay. It was like my first real effort. And then my last novel, which, well, what do you know, I have here. And so that was something that I also, wrote myself, edited myself, published myself, but I had it designed by this really wonderful designer who my publicist recommended me to. And he put everything together, and then I sent it to a printer who's called Ingram Spark, who's down in Tennessee. And they just did a marvelous job. It's like you can't really tell the difference between that and a professionally produced book. So I was very happy with it. And the little gold seal you see on it, I entered the book into 3 contests, 2 of which have not concluded yet, but one made this, announced that this book was a finalist, meaning that out of a little over 2,000 entries, this book was one of the top 100. So I was really blown away by that. And it's nice to know that somebody else likes your stuff. It's and you could say all you want, oh, I just write for myself, but it's like, oh, who are we for? It's writing for yourself can stroke your ego only so much. So it's nice to get the other part. So that felt really good. Let me give you a little background on how I discovered literature. I didn't read when I was in high school. I mean, I read a lot of nonfiction. Nonfiction I was very drawn to from an early age. Fiction is like, and I know there are a lot of people who don't spend a lot of time reading. And I mean, I unfortunately am like one of those lifelong smokers who suddenly quits and cannot stand the smell of smoke anymore. It's like, what's wrong with you? How can you not read? I mean, it's like, it's what gets me through life. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning. So I just books, no. So I was a journalism major when I was in college. And at the end of a spring semester, our teacher said, I'm going to give you an assignment for next year. Now, of course, we weren't going to have this teacher next year, so it was kind of like, a joke. He says, between now and September, I want everybody here to read 5 novels. And I knew nobody else in the class was going to read 5 novels. I always wanted to be the odd man. So I figured, I'm going to read 5 novels this summer. So what I did, as soon as we got out of the class, I went into the college bookstore and I bought 5 novels, which is something I'd never done in my life. And it's like, I'm gonna read one now. I got home and I'm like looking at it, and it's like, maybe tomorrow. And a couple of days go by and it's like, yeah, it's not moving anywhere. So I picked it up and I started reading, and it was like, oh my God, this is a life-changing experience. I'm actually enjoying this. And it wasn't so much a matter of where did it come from. It was just, my understanding that I just, for whatever the reason, wasn't ready for it when I was growing up. Everybody else in the world was, but that's okay. I was a slow learner. And so I started reading with a vengeance. And it was like, I'm not like one of those people on YouTube who read 60 books a year. Or 60 books a day, or however many they read. I tend to read very slowly and go over and go over and go over. But yeah, it was marvelous, and that's when I started really thinking about writing and what it was going to be like to be a real writer. When I write a novel or a short story, I always start with 3 things: a title, an opening line, and a closing line. And the problem, so to speak, is how to get from the opening line to the closing line. And that to me is always the hardest part of writing. It's like, you have a story, you know what you want to say, you know who your characters are going to be, but it's just a matter of how do you tell the story. Are you going to do a lot of short chapters? Are you going to do long chapters? Are you not going to break things? Is it going to be first person or third person? I always thought first person was much easier because it's basically like me sitting and dictating a story to somebody. But it feels different from third person. I always preferred reading third person. But yeah, it was interesting, and trying to get from point A to point Z. There's always like a template that I will end up following. It's like, okay, this book is going to be based on this, that, and the other thing, or this story is going to be based on this, that, and the other thing. And once I have that in mind, it becomes really more a sense of filling in the blanks. It's like, I know what the structure is going to be. And what I do at that point is I start putting together an outline. And outlines for me go in one of 2 directions. They're either incredibly detailed or they're incredibly sparse. Most of my outlines were incredibly detailed, and by the time I got to writing the book, it was basically just connecting one bulleted point to the next. But this book, my outline was incredibly sparse. It was 4.5 pages, and I just decided to be spontaneous, which, trust me, is something I'd never been in my life. And as Diane Chambers once said on Cheers, there is a time and place for spontaneity. And so, it was kind of like, but I was just sitting in front of my computer. It's like, oh my God, where's all this coming from? It was like turning on a faucet and shutting it off at the end of the day. And I would just, write. And it was fun. It was a lot of fun. So in a way, when you start with an outline and then you become more detailed and more detailed and more detailed to the point where you're finally at the finished product. It's kind of like an amoeba dividing itself into ever smaller units, but they start to multiply. I've always thought of writing as an act of discovery, never an act of creation, by which I mean, if I'm working on a book, I envision the book already written and it's sitting in front of me, but it's covered with a layer of dust. And what I have to do now is brush away the dust until, oh, there's a word. Oh, there's a sentence. Oh, there's a paragraph. Oh, there's a scene. And before you know it, the whole thing is done. And it's like, it's just been there all along. And, I end up taking little or no credit for having done it. It's like somebody else must have done this because I don't really think I'm capable of it. So that's kind of my fun way of looking at writing. Inspiration obviously comes from a huge variety of sources. When I wrote the book about the trial, as soon as the trial was over, I thought to myself, I've got to write a book about this. But it was 22 years until I actually got around to it. I knew I wasn't ready, but I thought the idea was good. And this book was actually inspired by something I once saw on a cooking show on television. It has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with cooking, but that was the inspiration. And that dated back 15 years. So it just takes a long time to ferment in my brain. There's a lot of fermentation that goes on in my brain, believe me. And finally, when the time was right, it's just like, okay, I think I'm ready to start on this now. And it's a great feeling. And I will sometimes have an idea for a couple of lines in my head, and I'll sit at my computer and I'll type them out. And then suddenly I'll see, oh, wow, I'm typing out something else. The most extreme example of that was when I had about 3 lines of text I really liked, and I sat at my computer about 1 PM, and I got up about 7 that night, and I had written like 25 pages. And that happened only once. It never happened again. And it's just, it's just a great feeling when it's there. And when it's not there, I don't even go near my computer, because I know I'm just going to type something that I'm writing for the sake of writing, and it's not going to be very good. And when I read it over, it's going to be, oh my God, where did that come from? So I kind of just, whenever it happens, it happens. Sometimes I've gotten up in the middle of the night with an idea, and I'll go to my computer and write it out. I'll be working on something, and okay, if anybody from my office is listening, please, put me on mute. I'll be working on something. I'll think, I've got to get this down, and I'll go write it. And then, of course, get back to work as soon as I can. And then as soon as the day is over, I'll go back and I'll really throw myself into the writing. Okay, you can unmute now. And I'll really throw myself into the writing. I know that there are a lot of writers, people who just write for a living, who say, okay, I'm going to get up at 10 o'clock, write till 12, break for lunch. Then at 1 o'clock, I'm going to start writing again and stop at 5. And it's like, I've never been able to wrap my mind around that. I don't know how people can do it. It must take such incredible, not so much self-control as you've got to have so many ideas there to just spill out on the page, one after the other over, the span of 8 or 10 hours in the course of a day. God bless them. I don't know how they do it. I couldn't. Or maybe I could, but I don't. So, so that's not how, I usually do it. But when the inspiration is there, I will usually know, and I just go with it until I get up to a stopping point. One thing I've always found interesting is that when I feel very inspired one day, chances are I'm going to feel very uninspired the next day, and almost invariably I will ask myself, "Oh, this is it. Yeah, I've lost it. I can't write anymore." And then a day later, it's like, "Oh, thank God, it's back," and I can sit at my computer and just type away. Um, my favorite part about writing is creating names. Uh, I never think, okay, I need a name for a character. The names just kind of come to my head. And when the name is right, I'll know it. And I think the thing about names is that when you read or hear a name, you immediately envision a person or a place or a thing, depending, of course, on what the name is describing. And the writer can go on for page after page describing it. And I don't know how it is for other readers, but for me, it's like, it doesn't matter. I already have the picture in my mind. You can describe this person any way you want. That's not how I'm seeing him or her. And that's why I think names are just so important. And when a name sounds right, it just, to me, it changes the whole feel of what I'm writing. Um, and polishing and finishing, when I write a scene, so we're going back to novels, not so much short stories. When I write a scene, I read it, I reread it, and then invariably I start cutting it down. And usually most of the scenes I've written are maybe half as long when they're finished as they are when I started them. I almost never enhance. I just always cut. Um, I remember one thing that I've kind of lived by all my life, which was really a marvelous observation. When I was in college and I was working for the college newspaper, um, one of the editors there said, after I'd written an article for him, said to me, "You're an overwriter." And he said, "That's great because people can always cut down what you've given them. If you're an underwriter, people are never going to know what the hell to make out of your scrawl." So it was like, okay, well, good, yes. And I always, use that as my inspiration for just cutting out what I think is unnecessary. And my rule of thumb is usually, if I can read through a scene twice without wanting to make any changes, this is twice after reading through it 600 or 700 times and constantly making changes, then it's like, okay, I'm ready to go on to the next scene. I suffer from what Ann Tyler memorably called the olive jar syndrome, in which she said, I can only write one scene at a time and write the next scene only when the first scene is completed. It's like picking olives out of a jar. You can't reach the second olive until the first olive has been successfully negotiated. So yeah, that's pretty much how it went. And then when I get all the scenes assembled and I read through the entire novel, sometimes I will say, you know, I like the pacing here. Now it's suddenly starting to drag, so I'll have to cut more. Or I like the pacing here, but this seems undeveloped. I'll have to add more. But there's usually less that has to be done than I expect. And I attribute that to being happy with everything I put together. And frankly, to having a very smallish bag of tricks so that, whatever I'm doing is like, okay, there's not much I can really change. So yeah, it's all good. Um, the hardest part of writing, as I said, is deciding how to get from the beginning to the end. And I will conclude, I can't believe I've actually been talking for 40 minutes. It doesn't seem long to me. I don't know. Other people might feel completely differently, and that's fine. But one of the really best lines I ever heard on inspiration was a wonderful interview that was done with Philip Roth, who I thought was just a titanic genius in the field of literature. Shortly before he died, he was interviewed at his home in Connecticut, and the interviewer and Philip Roth were sitting in his study where he did his writing, and on one of the shelves behind him was a little blackboard. It's like maybe yay wide by yay high, and it had all of these horizontal lines on it. And on these lines was a capital P, a lowercase p, a capital Q, and a lowercase q. Like brings us back to grammar school or elementary school or whatever we used to call it, where we were learning the alphabet. And the interviewer said, "What's that?" And he started laughing, and he said, "That's my inspiration." And she says, "Inspiration in what way?" And he said, "When I sit down at my computer and I have absolutely no idea what I want to say, I look at that and I remind myself all writing is putting one letter after another." And that's where I will leave off and open the table to any questions.
I have a question.
Oh, good.
What was the book that inspired you to read fiction? You read that book during the summer. What was it?
I believe it was, this takes me back a long way, Watership Down by Richard Adams.
I love that book too.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Which was an allegory set in a colony of rabbits. And oh my God, it was just like, this is great stuff. And it was like, wow, I really enjoy this. It was like, fiction can be fun. And it's not like I was starting with Ulysses. I mean, it was some. I used to tell myself, before I die, I want to read Finnegan's Wake, but I want to start at about 30 hours before my heart stops, about 30 minutes before my heart stops beating. So yeah, and that just really got me, into fiction. It's like, wow, this is marvelous stuff. And it was just a great feeling. It was just like like 1,000 doors suddenly opening.
Do you feel that you stick to one particular genre of writing, or?
I do. I guess, people call it, oh, it sounds so overdressed, but literary fiction. Yeah, I guess that's what I read. I think one reason I do that is because I came to literature so late, is that while everybody else in high school was going through the classics, except me, I just started reading the classics, and yeah, I mean, some of them are wonderful, some of them not so much. I recently finished War and Peace. God help me, it took me 6 months to get through. I will never have those 6 months back. I didn't hate it. I understand completely why some people think it's the greatest book ever written. It didn't float my boat. That was just me, But I mean, I think if anybody wants to learn how to write, that's a great place to start, because it really shows you a lot about what makes great writing great writing. But I usually like things that I can get through in, a couple of weeks' time.
Anybody else? Questions?
Questions?
Have another one.
Sure.
Other than War and Peace, what have you been reading lately?
I'm currently reading Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, there's a name you don't hear much anymore. And this is an allegory about the malignancy of Stalinism. And it is one of the best books I have ever picked up. It's brilliant on so many levels. It's a fantastic story. Solzhenitsyn was evidently a cancer patient at one point. And considering it was written in, I believe, the 60s, and you're reading about cancer treatments back then, I mean, you had chemotherapy, you had radiotherapy, but in their very early stages, and it's like, oh my God, how things have changed, and it's just fascinating to read about that, and the way he constantly brings up Stalin's name and the little digs, and it's just so marvelous. It just works on so many levels, and there are scenes about what doctors are going through, and that, I know when I was growing up, used to think, oh, doctors must have the best lives, they make all this money, they live in these beautiful houses, and it's like, oh my God, what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is just something much more than I could ever handle. And they're very special people. And all that is part of the book. So I recommend that absolutely. It's a longish book. It's like 539 pages, but it's a very fast read. It's just really, really, really excellent book.
Anybody else?
Are you writing anything now?
Yeah.
Sure.
For anyone wanting to get into fiction writing, what is one thing that you would suggest that they do, and one thing you would tell them to avoid or not do?
Oh, that's an excellent question. The first suggestion I would make is don't try to please anybody but yourself. And I say that because you don't know what other people are going to be attracted to. You only know what you're going to like. And if you do something, try to make yourself feel proud of what you did rather than try to make somebody else impressed with what you did. It could be great, and for whatever the reason, somebody else is going to think, I don't like it. It doesn't work for me, which doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it doesn't communicate to them. They always say, write what you know. I would say every character I've ever created is based on me. And yeah, I would say write what's most familiar and what you're most comfortable with, because if you start giving yourself all of these hills to climb, it's going to become tiring, at least at first. So just write whatever is there. It's not right and it's not wrong. It's just honest and sincere. And I think people respond more to sincerity than they respond to quote unquote quality. I think sincerity is really what impresses people the most. What I wouldn't do is at the risk of sounding like a complete asshole here, I wouldn't worry about what other people think. I would just write for yourself. That would be my best advice. Also, read a lot, because I find reading inspiring in the sense that sometimes I'll read a book and I will think, oh, I can do better than this. And sometimes I'll read a book and I'll think, I like this so much, I want to sound like that. And sometimes when that happens, I will start writing and I will reread it and I'll think, oh no, this isn't me. This sounds like the book I just put down. So it's, yeah. It's I think reading really does help as an inspiration.
We have a question in chat. Annie said that she just wants to know what you're working on now. And I know you gave some advice for beginning writers, but do you have any other advice for beginner writers, let's say?
Oh, sure. What am I working on now? Resting on my laurels. I wrote my last book as pretty much my last book. One thing that people, I'm sure, don't know or don't realize is I took little bits of all of my 11 short stories and my 3 previous novels, and I integrated them into here to make kind of a summing up of my achievement, I guess we could call it. And I don't have any burning desire to write more, on the subject of which I will share a wonderful quote with you. Saul Bellow, who was a stratospherically marvelous writer, once said that everybody's life could be boiled down to about 10 really good jokes, and this was his personal favorite. And this is the joke about the Italian opera singer. So first, the obligatory, stop me if you've heard this before. About why I don't write anymore. I think it can be summed up perfectly with this joke. An Italian opera singer comes to Carnegie Hall to give a recital, gets out on stage, sings everything he's going to sing. And at the end, the audience bursts into riotous applause and starts screaming and shouting and stamping their feet and yelling, "Bravo, bravo, encore." So he comes back and he does an encore. Well, this gets the audience even more excited than they were the first time. And again, they're screaming and shouting and stamping their feet and yelling, "Bravo, bravo, encore, encore." So he comes out and he does a second encore. Well, the audience cannot be satisfied, so they bring him out for a third encore, then a fourth encore. Finally, after 5 encores, exhausted and dripping with sweat, the man bows humbly and says, "Thank you, but how much longer do I have to keep this up?" And somebody from the last row shouts back, "Until you get it right." And so this time I felt like I got it right, so I don't really feel any need to do any more encores. Other information for beginning writers. Don't be afraid. Sit at your computer and write whatever comes to your mind. And we used to have this experiment in one of my college English classes, where you had to sit, this is in the days before computers, you had to sit and write whatever came to your mind for the next 15 minutes, which is a long time to spend writing if you have nothing you can think of. And people would just start, writing stream of consciousness, and then passing it off as James Joyce, of course. And just start writing a stream of consciousness, and then little while things would start to congeal and you'd start to get sentences, and it's like, I think I can work with this. It's kind of like, taking a lump of clay and molding it until you start to feel a body emerge. It's like another one of my favorite jokes, where an apprentice comes to a highly regarded sculptor and says, "How do I sculpt a horse?" At which the highly regarded sculptor laughs and says, "It's very simple. Take a block of granite and chip away everything that isn't a horse." And that's really what happens when you just start writing. It's like things will start to create themselves. And then you start to think, that wasn't so bad. Maybe I should try this again. And you put as little pressure on yourself as possible. I think as with so many things, it's problematic if you put too much pressure on and you think, I've got to get this just right. It's like you don't. Again, it's not math. There's no right and no wrong. It's just express yourself. And everybody has a completely different voice. Everybody's voice is unique. And it's just, you know, a good and hopefully easy way to get into writing. And if you love it, that's wonderful. And if you don't love it, that's wonderful too. You might not want to pursue it at one point. You might pick it up later. You might pick it up the following day. You might pick it up the following week or the following month or the following year. But yeah, it's great. It's great. You know, so that there are really no rules to follow. So sometimes rules are nice because it makes it easier, but sometimes, you know, you can make up your own rules, and it gives you a lot of control. It's one of the things I like about writing, and it's one of the things I like about self-publishing is that, you know, I'm not at the whim of 50 people who are saying, oh, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to sell this unless we basically rewrite your novel, give it a different name, and put on a cover that you don't really like. So yeah, so it's fine.
Do we have any other questions from anybody? All right, doesn't seem like it. So thank you, Eric, very much. We enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And right now I'm going to share the screen so you guys can see the other events that we have in this series.
So thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed having you. And otherwise I would have been speaking to myself, which would have felt incredibly awkward. So thank you again, and check the library's calendar because this is one of a series of events. I am not getting paid for saying this. One of a series of events with creative people, and the ones that I've seen have all been really good. So thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.